First story, The Lost Squadron in Afghanistan, 2009. It was supposed to be a routine operation in the rugged mountains of Afghanistan. Our unit, a seasoned group of Special Forces operatives, had been tasked with gathering intel on suspected Taliban movements in the area. We'd done this countless times before, but nothing could have prepared us for what was about to unfold. The day started like any other. We geared up, checked our equipment, and set out under the cover of darkness. The air was crisp, and the stars shone brightly in the clear night sky. Little did we know that those same stars would soon become a source of terror and confusion. As we made our way through the rocky terrain, I couldn't shake off an eerie feeling that something was different. This time, the silence was too profound, the shadows too deep. Even the most experienced among us seemed on edge, though no one dared to voice their concerns. We had a mission to complete, and we were determined to see it through. But as the night wore on, that determination would be put to the test in ways we could never have imagined. It was around 0200 hours when we first noticed the lights. At first, we thought they might be distant flares, or maybe even a mirage caused by the thin mountain air. But as we watched, transfixed, it became clear that these were no ordinary lights. They moved with an impossible grace, defying the laws of physics as they darted across the sky. Colors shifted and pulsed, blues, greens, and purples that seemed to ripple through the air like liquid fire. I remember turning to my squad leader, his face a mask of confusion and fear that I'm sure mirrored my own. We'd all heard stories, of course. Whispered tales of unexplained phenomena in war zones, things that couldn't be logically explained away. But we were trained soldiers, not conspiracy theorists. We dealt in hard facts and tactical realities, not science fiction fantasies. Yet here we were, watching as the impossible unfolded before our eyes. I felt my heart racing, my palms sweating despite the cool night air. Something was very, very wrong. The radio crackled to life, startling us all. Our CO's voice came through, tense and urgent. "Command, this is Echo 6. We have visual on unidentified aerial phenomena. Request immediate instructions." The response was immediate, but not what we expected. Instead of the calm, professional tone we were used to, the voice on the other end sounded panicked. "Echo 6, fall back immediately. I repeat, fall back to extraction point Alpha. Do not engage. Do not..." The transmission cut off abruptly, replaced by a high-pitched whine that made us all wince in pain. And then, silence. Complete and utter silence. Not just radio silence, but an absence of sound so profound it felt like a physical weight pressing down on us. The ambient noises of the night, the wind, the distant calls of animals, all of it vanished in an instant. In that moment of deafening quiet, the lights in the sky seemed to pulse with renewed intensity. They were closer now, much closer, and I could swear I felt a vibration in the air, a thrumming energy that made my teeth ache and my vision blur. Someone in the squad, I couldn't tell who, let out a strangled cry. "What the fuck is happening?" But before anyone could respond, the world around us exploded into blinding, searing light. The next thing I remember is the cold. A bone-deep, penetrating chill that seemed to come from within rather than without. I opened my eyes, or at least I thought I did, but all I could see was a hazy, blue-tinged darkness. My body felt wrong, somehow. Heavy and light at the same time, as if gravity itself had become inconsistent. I tried to move, to call out to my squad mates, but my muscles refused to respond. Panic began to set in as I realized I couldn't even feel my own heartbeat. Was I dead? In some kind of limbo? The rational part of my mind tried to make sense of the situation, grasping for any logical explanation. Maybe we'd been hit by some kind of experimental weapon, something that interfered with our nervous systems. But deep down, I knew that wasn't it. This was something else entirely, something beyond the realm of human technology or understanding. As my vision slowly began to clear, I became aware of shapes moving around me, tall, slender figures that seemed to glide rather than walk. Their outlines were blurry, as if they existed slightly out of phase with reality itself. I strained to focus, to make out any details, but it was like trying to look through frosted glass. The more I tried, the more my head throbbed with a pain so intense it threatened to split my skull. One of the figures approached, leaning over me. I could feel its presence more than see it. A sense of vast alien intelligence that made my mind recoil in terror. A hand, if you could call it that, reached towards my face. Long, impossibly thin fingers with too many joints. I wanted to scream, to fight, to do anything but lie there helplessly. But my body remained paralyzed, a prisoner in its own skin. The moment those fingers made contact with my forehead, a flood of images and sensations overwhelmed me. Planets I'd never seen, civilizations beyond imagination, the vast, cold emptiness of space. All of it poured into my consciousness in a torrent of information too vast for my human brain to process. I don't know how long I was in that state. Minutes, hours, days. Time seemed to have lost all meaning. Occasionally I'd catch glimpses of my squad mates, their bodies suspended in some kind of translucent pods, expressions frozen in masks of terror or confusion. I wanted to reach out to them, to offer some kind of comfort or reassurance, but I remained trapped in my own personal hell of sensory overload and paralysis. The beings, I couldn't bring myself to call them aliens, though I knew that's what they were, continued their methodical examination. I felt things being inserted into my body, a cold, clinical probing that should have been agonizing, but instead just felt distant, like it was happening to someone else. At some point, I became aware of a rhythmic beeping sound, faint but persistent. It took me a while to realize it was my own heartbeat, amplified and distorted. The sound grew louder, faster, until it was all I could focus on. My vision began to darken at the edges, the alien landscape around me fading away. The last thing I remember before losing consciousness entirely was a sense of movement, of being lifted and carried, and then, mercifully, oblivion. When I finally regained consciousness, the harsh Afghan sun was beating down on my face, its intense heat a stark contrast to the bone-chilling cold I'd experienced wherever I'd been. I found myself lying on rocky ground, my uniform caked with dust and sweat. As I struggled to sit up, my head spinning and my stomach churning, I realized I wasn't alone. The rest of my squad was scattered around me, all in various states of confusion and distress. Some were still unconscious, while others were mumbling incoherently or staring blankly into space. I tried to piece together what had happened, but my memories were fragmented, like shards of a broken mirror that refused to form a complete picture. The last clear thing I remembered was the lights in the sky, and then flashes, cold metal, Strange beings, pain and fear, and a sense of violation so profound it made me want to claw my own skin off. But the details slipped away like water through my fingers every time I tried to grasp them. I stumbled to my feet, fighting waves of nausea and dizziness, and made my way to our communications officer. His radio was fried, emitting nothing but static and an occasional high-pitched whine that sent shivers down my spine. It was then that I noticed something else. My watch had stopped. So had everyone else's. According to the frozen displays, we'd lost 3 days, 3 entire days that were just gone, missing from our lives like they'd never existed. The next few hours were a blur of confusion, fear, and desperate attempts to make sense of our situation. We took stock of our supplies, trying to ration what little water and food we had left. Some of the guys were in bad shape, dehydrated, disoriented, and displaying symptoms I'd never seen before. Strange rashes that seemed to glow faintly in the shadows. Nosebleeds that wouldn't stop. And the headaches, God, the headaches. It felt like our skulls were being split open from the inside. We tried to piece together what had happened, but no one's story lined up. Some swore we'd been attacked by insurgents with some kind of advanced weaponry. Others babbled about lights in the sky and lost time. A few couldn't remember anything at all after we'd set out on our mission. I kept my own fragmented memories to myself, afraid that voicing them would somehow make them more real, more terrifying. As the day wore on, we managed to get our bearings and start moving towards what we hoped was the nearest base. The trek was grueling, made worse by our weakened condition and the oppressive heat. Every step was an effort, every breath a struggle. The landscape around us seemed alien and hostile, as if the very mountains were conspiring against us. More than once, I caught myself looking up at the sky, half expecting to see those impossible lights again. But there was nothing but the sun, relentless and uncaring, beating down on us as we stumbled through the rocky terrain. It was late afternoon when we heard the distant thrum of helicopter rotors. The sound filled me with equal parts relief and dread. Relief that we'd finally be rescued. Dread at having to explain what had happened, or rather, what we couldn't explain. As the choppers approached, I saw the looks on my squad mates' faces, a mix of exhaustion, confusion, and something else. A haunted look that I knew was mirrored in my own eyes. We'd been through something that defied explanation or understanding, and I knew in that moment that our lives would never be the same. The rescue team that rappelled down to us looked shocked at our condition. I heard snatches of their radio chatter, words like radiation and quarantine that sent a fresh wave of fear through me. As they loaded us onto the helicopters, I caught a glimpse of myself reflected in one of the medics' visors. I barely recognized the gaunt, wild-eyed man staring back at me. My skin was pale and clammy, dark circles under my eyes making them look sunken and hollow. But it was the expression that truly frightened me, a look of someone who'd seen things no human was ever meant to see. As we lifted off, leaving behind the mountains that had been the stage for our inexplicable ordeal, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning. That whatever had happened to us out there in the vast, empty wilderness wasn't over. It was merely the opening act in a cosmic drama that we'd been unwillingly cast in. Actors on a stage we couldn't even begin to comprehend. The days that followed our rescue were a blur of medical examinations, debriefings, and increasingly desperate attempts to make sense of what had happened to us. We were quarantined in a high-security military hospital, subjected to a battery of tests that seemed to go on forever. Blood work, MRIs, psychological evaluations, you name it, they did it. And with each test, the doctors' expressions grew more concerned, more bewildered. They kept throwing around terms like unprecedented cellular changes and inexplicable radiation signatures. I overheard one of them saying our DNA had been altered in ways that shouldn't be possible with current technology, but it was the nightmares that really got to me. Every time I closed my eyes, I was back there, surrounded by those beings, feeling their cold, clinical touch as they examined me like some kind of lab specimen. The worst part was, I couldn't tell if these were memories or just my traumatized mind trying to fill in the blanks. Sometimes, in the depths of these night terrors, I'd wake up screaming, convinced I could still feel their presence in the room. The other guys were going through similar hell. We'd hear each other's screams echoing through the hospital corridors. At night, a chorus of terror and confusion that no amount of sedatives seemed able to quiet. During the day, we'd sit in our rooms, avoiding each other's gazes, each of us lost in our own private hell of fragmented memories and unanswerable questions. As the days turned into weeks, it became clear that whatever had happened to us out there in the Afghan mountains had changed us on a fundamental level. The doctors were baffled by our test results. Our bodies were producing enzymes and proteins they'd never seen before. Our brain scans showed activity in regions that were supposed to be dormant. And then there were the other changes. It started small at first. Objects moving slightly when we weren't looking directly at them. Lights flickering when our emotions ran high. We tried to rationalize it, to convince ourselves it was just stress or some kind of shared delusion. But deep down, we knew. We'd brought something back with us, something that defied scientific explanation. I remember the day one of my squad mates, Johnson, lost control during a particularly intense interrogation session. The room literally shook, glass shattering and equipment flying off the shelves as if hit by an invisible force. The look of terror on the face of the CIA agent questioning him. I'll never forget it. It was the same look I'd seen in the mirror every day since our rescue. The look of someone whose entire worldview had been shattered in an instant. After that incident, the nature of our confinement changed. We weren't just patients anymore. We were test subjects, potential weapons. The very government we'd sworn to protect now viewed us with a mixture of fear and fascination. I couldn't help but wonder if this was how those beings had seen us. As specimens to be studied, possibly weaponized. The irony wasn't lost on me. Months passed, and the questions only multiplied. Why us? Why that particular mission? Was it random chance? Or had we been specifically chosen? And for what purpose? The more we tried to piece it together, the more elusive the answers became. Our memories of the event remained frustratingly fragmented, like shards of a broken mirror reflecting distorted glimpses of an impossible reality. Sometimes, in the quiet hours of the night, I'd find myself staring out the window of my hospital room, looking up at the stars. They didn't seem benign anymore. Instead, they felt like distant, watching eyes, keepers of secrets too vast and terrible for human comprehension. I couldn't shake the feeling that our encounter was just the tip of the iceberg, a small peek behind the curtain of a universe far stranger and more complex than we'd ever imagined. The worst part was the sense of unfinished business, like we were pieces in a cosmic game whose rules and objectives were beyond our understanding. Every unexplained phenomenon, every odd coincidence, became potential evidence of ongoing interference. A global blackout that lasted 17 minutes and was never adequately explained. Must be them. Unusual weather patterns and inexplicable animal behavior. Clearly a sign. We were seeing patterns everywhere, unable to trust our own perceptions. Were we paranoid, or had our eyes simply been opened to a reality most people couldn't or wouldn't see? As time wore on, the government's interest in us seemed to wane, or at least become less overt. We were eventually released from the hospital, but our lives were far from normal. We were placed in a kind of halfway house, ostensibly for our own protection, but we all knew we were still being watched, studied. The episodes, as we'd taken to calling them, continued. Moments when reality itself seemed to bend around us, when the laws of physics became more like polite suggestions. It could be something as small as knowing who was calling before the phone rang, or as dramatic as objects levitating during moments of intense emotion. We learned to control it to some extent, but it was like trying to harness a wild animal, unpredictable and potentially dangerous. The worst part was the isolation. We couldn't talk to our families or friends about what had happened. Who would believe us? Hell, half the time I didn't believe it myself. And the few times I tried to broach the subject with people outside our group, I was met with looks of concern, pity, or outright disbelief. The world had moved on, oblivious to the fact that everything had changed. Wars were still fought, politicians still lied, people still went about their daily lives as if the universe wasn't infinitely stranger and more terrifying than they could possibly imagine. Sometimes I envied them their ignorance. It was during one of our group therapy sessions, mandated by the military brass who still didn't know quite what to do with us, that things took another turn. We were sitting in the sterile conference room, going through the motions of talking about our experiences without really saying anything, when suddenly every electronic device in the room went haywire. Phones, tablets, even the digital clock on the wall, all of them started flashing the same sequence of numbers over and over. 31415926. It took me a moment to recognize it, the first few digits of pi. As we stared in shock, the air in the room seemed to thicken, charged with an energy that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. And then we all felt it at once. That same sensation we'd experienced in the mountains, the feeling of being watched, studied, by something vast and incomprehensible. For a brief, terrifying moment, it was like we were back there, suspended, in that blue-tinged darkness, surrounded by those impossible beings. And then, as quickly as it had started, it was over. The devices returned to normal, the oppressive feeling lifted. We looked at each other, pale and shaken, the unspoken question hanging in the air. What did it mean? Was it a message, a warning, or something else entirely? Our therapist, visibly rattled, tried to rationalize what had happened. A power surge, mass hysteria, anything but the truth we all felt in our bones. This wasn't over. Whatever had begun in those mountains was still unfolding, and we were caught in the middle of it. In the weeks that followed, we threw ourselves into research, trying to find any similar incidents, any clues that might help us understand what was happening. We pored over declassified government files, conspiracy theory forums, ancient texts, anything that might shed light on our situation. What we found was both terrifying and strangely comforting. There were others out there, people who'd had experiences similar to ours. Abductions, missing time, unexplained abilities. The details varied, but the core elements were the same. We weren't alone, but that realization brought its own set of questions and fears. How long had this been going on? How deep did it go? Were governments aware? Complicit? The more we dug, the more we realized how little we truly knew about the world we lived in, about the forces at work behind the scenes of what we considered reality. One night, unable to sleep, I found myself standing on the balcony of our facility, staring up at the stars. As I watched, one of them seemed to move, tracing an impossible path across the sky. In that moment, I was gripped by a profound sense of smallness, of being a tiny speck in an unimaginably vast and complex universe. But along with that feeling came something else, a sense of purpose. Whatever had happened to us, whatever was still happening, we were part of something bigger than ourselves. We had been chosen, for better or worse, to be witnesses to a truth most people would never know. It's been years now since that fateful night in the Afghan mountains. Years of questions, of searching, of trying to come to terms with what happened to us and what it means. Some of my squad mates have tried to move on, to forget, to build some semblance of a normal life. Others have embraced the changes using their new abilities in ways that walk a fine line between heroism and vigilantism. Me? I'm still searching for answers. I've traveled the world, chasing leads, meeting others who've had similar experiences. I've seen things that defy explanation, encountered truths that shatter everything we think we know about the nature of reality. And yet, for every question answered, a dozen more spring up in its place. The beings, the aliens for lack of a better term, haven't made direct contact again. Not with us anyway. But their presence, their influence, is everywhere if you know how to look. In the unexplained phenomena that make brief headlines before being forgotten or debunked. In the whispered stories of encounters in remote places. In the very fabric of our world, which seems increasingly like a thin veil over something far stranger and more complex. I don't know if I'll ever fully understand what happened to us or why, but I do know this. The universe is vaster, more mysterious, and more alive than we ever imagined. And we, all of us, are part of something far greater than we can comprehend. So I keep watching the skies, keep searching for answers, because I know now that we're not alone. We never were. And someday, somehow, I believe we'll understand why. Second story, The Blue Light of the Gulf War, 1991. It was just another scorching day in the Kuwaiti desert back in '91. The sun beat down mercilessly on our convoy as we patrolled the endless sea of sand. I was a young soldier then, fresh-faced, and eager to serve my country in Operation Desert Storm. Little did I know that this routine mission would turn into the most terrifying experience of my life, one that would haunt me for years to come. Our unit had been assigned to sweep the area for any remaining Iraqi forces. But so far, we'd encountered nothing but dust devils and the occasional abandoned vehicle. The monotony of the desert landscape had lulled us into a false sense of security. As our trucks rumbled across the dunes, the radio crackled with chatter, mostly complaints about the heat and jokes to keep our spirits up. I remember laughing at some dumb pun my buddy Jake had made when suddenly the world around us changed in an instant. It started with a low hum, barely audible over the roar of our engines. At first, I thought it was just the wind picking up, maybe a sandstorm brewing on the horizon. But then I saw it, a faint blue glow in the sky like nothing I'd ever seen before. It wasn't the shimmering heat mirages we'd grown accustomed to. This was something else entirely. The glow intensified, pulsing with an otherworldly energy that sent shivers down my spine despite the blistering heat. I called out to the others, my voice tight with a mix of awe and growing fear. As we all turned our eyes to the sky, the blue light suddenly expanded, shooting down towards us like a spotlight from heaven or hell. It engulfed the lead truck in our convoy, bathing it in an eerie azure radiance that seemed to distort the very air around it. Time seemed to slow to a crawl as we watched in horror. The truck, along with the 4 soldiers inside, began to lift off the ground. I could hear screams through the radio, panicked voices crying out for help as they were pulled upward by some invisible force. The rest of us were frozen in place, our minds unable to process what we were seeing. It was like something out of a sci-fi movie, but this was real. Too real. As the truck rose higher, I caught glimpses of dark, elongated shapes moving within the blue light. They weren't human, that much I could tell. Their movements were too fluid, too alien. My heart pounded in my chest, and I felt a primal urge to run, to hide, to do anything to escape whatever was happening. But my training kicked in, and I found myself reaching for my weapon, even though I knew deep down it would be useless against whatever force we were facing. The scene before us continued to unfold like a nightmare come to life. The blue light pulsed and throbbed, casting strange shadows across the desert sands. I could hear the frantic voices of my fellow soldiers, some shouting orders, others praying, in hushed, terrified tones. The truck was now fully suspended in the air, rotating slowly as if being examined by some unseen entity. I squinted, trying to make out the faces of my comrades trapped inside. But the light was too bright, too alien. Suddenly there was a deafening crack like thunder splitting the sky, and the blue beam intensified tenfold. The light was so bright it seared my retinas, forcing me to shield my eyes. When I looked again, the truck was gone, vanished into thin air, along with the 4 men inside. The blue light retreated just as quickly as it had appeared, shrinking back into the sky until it was nothing more than a pinprick, and then it, too, was gone. The desert fell silent, save for the pounding of my heart and the ragged breathing of the men around me. We stood there, dumbstruck, for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. No one wanted to be the first to speak, to acknowledge what we had just witnessed. It was as if, by remaining silent, we could somehow pretend it hadn't happened, that our friends hadn't just been snatched away by something beyond our comprehension. The aftermath of the incident was a blur of confusion, disbelief, and barely contained panic. Our commanding officer, Captain Rodriguez, was the first to snap out of the daze that had gripped us all. His voice, usually so steady and assured, trembled slightly as he barked orders to secure the area and call for backup. I remember moving, on autopilot, my body going through the motions of setting up a perimeter while my mind raced with questions I knew would never be answered. What had we just seen? Where were our comrades? And most terrifyingly, would whatever took them be coming back for the rest of us? The wait for reinforcements felt like an eternity. Every shadow, every glint of light on the horizon sent a jolt of fear through me. I kept expecting to see that blue beam return, to feel myself being lifted off the ground and pulled into the unknown. The other guys felt it too. I could see it in their eyes, in the way they jumped at every little sound. We were trained soldiers, hardened by weeks of combat, but this was something no amount of training could have prepared us for. When the helicopters finally arrived, along with a team of intelligence officers and what looked like scientists, the reality of what had happened began to sink in. This wasn't some bizarre hallucination brought on by heat and stress. It was real, and judging by the grim faces of the newcomers, it was something they had encountered before. The debriefing that followed was unlike anything I'd ever experienced in my military career. We were separated, questioned for hours on end about every minute detail of what we had seen. The interviewers seemed particularly interested in the shapes we had glimpsed within the light, pressing us for descriptions, asking if we had heard any unusual sounds or felt any strange sensations. I told them everything I could remember. Never felt like enough. How could mere words capture the terror, the sheer otherworldliness of what we had witnessed? As the days turned into weeks, and weeks into months, the official story began to take shape. There was talk of experimental aircraft, of secret weapons tests gone wrong. But we knew the truth. We had seen something that defied explanation, something that didn't belong in this world. The 4 men who disappeared that day were listed as missing in action, their families told that they had been lost during a classified operation. It was a lie, of course, but what else could they say? How do you tell a mother, a wife, a child, that their loved one was taken by a beam of blue light into the sky, never to be seen again? The guilt of surviving, of being left behind, ate away at me. I couldn't shake the feeling that it should have been me in that truck, that somehow I had cheated fate. Nightmares plagued my sleep, vivid recreations of that moment when the light engulfed the vehicle. But in my dreams, I could see inside. I saw my friends' faces contorted in terror, their bodies twisted and changed by whatever force had taken them. I would wake up screaming, drenched in sweat, the blue light still burning behind my eyelids. As the years passed, I tried to move on with my life, to put the incident behind me. But it was always there, lurking in the back of my mind, coloring every aspect of my existence. I left the military as soon as my tour was up, unable to continue, serving in a world that suddenly seemed so much larger and more terrifying than I had ever imagined. Civilian life was a challenge. How do you explain to potential employers that you can't work night shifts because the darkness brings back memories of that ethereal blue glow? How do you tell a therapist that your PTSD isn't just from the usual horrors of war, but from an encounter with something that shouldn't exist? I found myself drawn to others who had experienced similar phenomena, spending countless hours in online forums and attending UFO conventions. Some called us crazy, delusional, but we knew what we had seen. We were the ones left behind, the witnesses to something that defied explanation. I connected with other veterans who had been there that day, and together we pieced together more of what had happened. It wasn't just our unit. There had been other incidents, other disappearances. The blue light had been seen by civilians too, not just in Kuwait, but in other parts of the world. It was as if something had been watching us, studying us, and occasionally reaching down to pluck humans from the earth like samples in some cosmic experiment. One night, about 5 years after the incident, I received a phone call that turned my world upside down once again. It was Jake's wife, Sarah. Jake had been one of the men in the truck that disappeared. She was calling to tell me that Jake had been found, alive, in the middle of the Mojave Desert. My heart raced as she spoke, hope and fear warring within me. Jake was in a military hospital, she said, and he was asking for me. I didn't hesitate. Within hours I was on a plane, my mind reeling with questions. What had happened to Jake? Where had he been all this time? and why had he suddenly reappeared after 5 long years? The hospital was a fortress of security and secrecy. I was questioned, searched, and made to sign more non-disclosure agreements than I could count before they finally let me see Jake. Nothing could have prepared me for what I found in that sterile white room. Jake was there, yes, but he was changed in ways I couldn't begin to comprehend. His skin had a strange bluish tint to it, and his eyes... God, his eyes were like looking into the depths of the universe itself. When he spoke, his voice was a raspy whisper, as if he had forgotten how to use it. "They're coming back," he said, gripping my arm with surprising strength. They showed me everything." I listened, horrified and fascinated, as Jake recounted fragments of his experience. He spoke of vast distances traveled in the blink of an eye, of beings made of light and thought, of a plan so immense it spanned millennia. Most of it didn't make sense, and I got the feeling that Jake's mind was struggling to translate what he had experienced into terms a human could understand. The military doctors were at a loss to explain Jake's condition. His DNA had been altered in ways they couldn't explain, and his brain scans showed activity in regions they didn't even know existed. They kept him isolated, running test after test, but I could see the fear in their eyes. They were out of their depth, facing something that all their years of scientific knowledge couldn't explain. I was allowed to visit Jake several times over the next few weeks, but with each visit, he seemed to slip further away. The lucid moments became fewer and far between, replaced by long periods of silence where he would stare at the ceiling, mouthing words in a language that no one could understand. It was during one of these visits that things took an even stranger turn. I was sitting by Jake's bed, talking to him even though I wasn't sure he could hear me, when suddenly the lights in the room began to flicker. A low hum filled the air, a sound that made my blood run cold because I had heard it once before, in the desert all those years ago. Jake's eyes snapped open, and he sat up in bed, his gaze fixed on a point above my head. "They're here," he whispered, a smile spreading across his face. It was the most human expression I had seen from him since his return, and it terrified me more than anything else. I turned, following his gaze, and that's when I saw it. A faint blue glow beginning to seep through the ceiling tiles. Panic seized me as the familiar blue light began to intensify. My mind raced, torn between the instinct to flee and the need to protect Jake. Alarms blared throughout the facility, and I could hear shouting and the pounding of boots in the hallway outside. But it all seemed distant, muffled, as if the blue light was somehow isolating us from the rest of the world. Jake remained eerily calm, his eyes wide with what I can only describe as reverence. "Don't be afraid," he said, his voice stronger than I'd heard it since his return. "They're not here to harm us. They're here to prepare us." Before I could ask what he meant, the light engulfed the room entirely. The sensation was indescribable, like being submerged in warm electric jelly. My body felt weightless, and for a moment I thought we were being lifted just like that truck in Kuwait. But then the light receded as quickly as it had come, leaving Jake and me alone in the room once more. Except something had changed. The medical equipment that had been monitoring Jake was fried, sparking and smoking. And Jake was different. The sickly pallor that had clung to him since his return was gone. He looked healthy, vibrant, almost glowing from within. His eyes met mine, and I saw recognition there. Not just of me, but of something far beyond. "It's time," he said, swinging his legs over the side of the bed. "They've shown me what's coming, and we need to prepare." What followed was a whirlwind of chaos and revelation. Jake, suddenly imbued with strength and purpose, led me through the panicked halls of the facility. Guards and medical staff were too disoriented by what had just happened to stop us. As we made our way to the exit, Jake spoke rapidly, his words pouring out in a torrent of information that I struggled to comprehend. He talked about the beings that had taken him, creatures of pure energy that existed beyond our understanding of time and space. They weren't malevolent, he insisted, but they weren't exactly benevolent either. Earth was part of a grand experiment, a test to see if our species could evolve beyond our physical limitations. The abductions, the sightings, the strange phenomena, all of it was part of their study. But now, something had changed. A cosmic deadline was approaching, and humanity needed to be ready. I listened, half in awe and half in disbelief, as we commandeered a vehicle and sped away from the facility. Jake's words painted a picture of a universe far more complex and interconnected than we had ever imagined. He spoke of other dimensions, brushing against our own, of civilizations' rise and fall across the vastness of space, and of a coming convergence that would reshape reality itself. Part of me wanted to dismiss it all as the ravings of a man broken by his experiences, but I couldn't. Not after what I'd seen, both in Kuwait and in that hospital room. The blue light had changed something in me too, awakening a sense that had long lain dormant. I could feel the truth in Jake's words, even if I couldn't fully understand them. As we drove through the night, Jake's story became more focused, more urgent. The beings, he never gave them a name, saying our language lacked the concepts to truly describe them, had chosen him and the others from our unit as ambassadors of sorts. They had been taken, studied, and imbued with knowledge that would be crucial in the coming years. But the process had been too much for human minds to bear, which is why Jake had been in such a deteriorated state when he was returned. The second encounter in the hospital had completed the transformation, fully integrating the alien knowledge with his human consciousness. Now, he explained, we had work to do. There were others like us scattered around the world, people who had encountered the blue light and been changed by it. We needed to find them, to bring them together. A network was forming, he said, of humans who could serve as conduits between our world and theirs. I found myself swept up in Jake's mission, my old life falling away as we crisscrossed the country, seeking out others who had been touched by the phenomenon. We moved in the shadows, always one step ahead of the military and government agencies that were trying to track us down. I became Jake's protector, his link to the human world, as he grappled with the vast knowledge now contained within his mind. It wasn't easy. There were times when the enormity of what we were dealing with threatened to overwhelm me. The things Jake revealed about the nature of reality, about humanity's place in the cosmos, were terrifying in their implications. But there was also a sense of purpose, of being part of something greater than myself, that kept me going. As our network grew, so did the frequency of the blue light sightings. Reports flooded in from around the globe. Strange lights in the sky, people vanishing only to reappear days or weeks later changed. Inexplicable phenomena that defied the laws of physics. The world was waking up to the fact that we were not alone, and the reaction was a mix of wonder, fear, and chaos. Governments scrambled to maintain control, alternating between denying the reality of what was happening and attempting to weaponize it. Religious leaders proclaimed the end times or heralded a new age of enlightenment. Through it all, our group worked tirelessly, guided by Jake and others like him who had been given glimpses of what was to come. We established safe houses, developed methods of communication that couldn't be intercepted by conventional means, and began to piece together the larger picture of what the beings were preparing us for. It wasn't just about first contact or cultural exchange. It was about the very fabric of reality itself. Jake explained that our universe was one of many, existing in a delicate balance. Periodically, these universes would align, creating windows of opportunity for passage between them. The beings had discovered that conscious minds could serve as anchors during these alignments, stabilizing the connections between realities. Humanity, with our unique blend of physical form and developing consciousness, was ideally suited for this role. But we needed to evolve, to expand our awareness beyond the limits of our three-dimensional perception. The abductions, the experiments, the gradual reveal of their existence, it was all part of a process to prepare us for this cosmic duty. As the predicted alignment drew closer, the pace of our work intensified. We faced opposition from all sides. Government agents who saw us as a threat to national security, religious zealots who branded us as heretics or demons, and ordinary people driven to panic by the increasing strangeness of the world around them. There were losses along the way, members of our group captured or killed, but for each one we lost, it seemed two more would step forward, awakened to the truth by their own encounters with the blue light. The beings themselves became more active, their appearances less subtle. The skies were alive with lights, and reports of direct interactions between humans and these entities became commonplace. It was a time of wonder and terror, of unprecedented scientific breakthroughs and societal upheaval. Through it all, Jake remained our beacon, interpreting the messages from beyond and guiding us toward the ultimate goal. I watched as the man I had once known as a fellow soldier transformed into something more, not quite human anymore, but not fully alien either. He was a bridge between worlds, carrying the weight of two realities in his transformed mind. There were moments when I caught glimpses of the old Jake, flashes of humor or shared memories of our time in Kuwait, but they grew fewer as the alignment approached. He was focused entirely on the task at hand, driven by a purpose that transcended individual concerns. The day of the alignment arrived with a sky that defied description. Aurora-like lights danced from horizon to horizon in colors that shouldn't exist in nature. The air thrummed with energy, making every hair on my body stand on end. Our group had gathered at a remote location, following the guidance Jake had received. As the hour approached, I felt a mixture of anticipation and fear, unlike anything I'd ever experienced. Jake stood at the center of our circle, his eyes closed, his body seeming to vibrate in harmony with the energy around us. When he spoke, his voice carried an otherworldly resonance. "It's time," he said, echoing the words he'd spoken in the hospital room that now felt like a lifetime ago. "Remember your training. Open your minds. We are the anchors, the bridges between worlds. What we do today will echo across realities." As one, our group began the techniques we'd practiced, a combination of meditation, focused thought, and something more, something that defied easy categorization. I felt my consciousness expand, pushing against the boundaries of my physical form. The blue light appeared, not from the sky this time, but emanating from within each of us. It grew, enveloping us, connecting us in a web of energy that pulsed with life and possibility. And then, in a moment of transcendent clarity, I saw it, or rather, I perceived it, for what I experienced went beyond mere vision. The multiverse stretched before me, an infinite tapestry of realities all existing simultaneously. I felt the presence of the beings, their vast intelligence encompassing and guiding us as we formed the connections between worlds. What followed is almost impossible to describe in human terms. Time lost all meaning as we hung suspended between realities, our expanded consciousness serving as the vital links in a cosmic chain. I was aware of vast energies flowing through us, of information and experiences beyond anything a human mind was meant to comprehend. It was beautiful and terrifying, ecstatic and agonizing. Through it all, I clung to my sense of self, to the memory of who I was and why I was there. When it was over, though over isn't quite the right word for something that exists outside of linear time, we found ourselves back in our physical bodies, changed in ways that would take years to fully understand. The world around us had changed too. The alignment had altered the very nature of our reality, opening humanity to a broader cosmic community. In the days and weeks that followed, as we struggled to integrate our experiences, it became clear that this was just the beginning. The beings had prepared us for this role, but it was up to us to navigate the new reality we found ourselves in. Jake and others like him would serve as ambassadors and interpreters, helping humanity adjust to its new place in the multiverse. As for me, I was left with the profound understanding that what I had experienced in the Kuwaiti desert all those years ago was just the first step on an incredible journey. The blue light that had once filled me with terror now represented hope. Hope for a future where the boundaries between worlds were not barriers, but bridges to be crossed. The universe I now knew was far stranger and more wonderful than we had ever imagined, and we were no longer alone in it. If you're enjoying this and want to support the channel in bringing more chilling stories like this, any contribution is greatly appreciated. The donation link is just below this video. It's safe, easy, and fast. No registration required. Even the smallest support means so much. Thank you for joining me on this journey. Third story. The Day Aliens Stole a Nazi Tank, 1943. It was 1943, and I was stationed in Italy as part of the Allied forces during World War II. The air was thick with tension, and the constant sound of artillery fire had become our daily soundtrack. I never imagined that amidst the chaos of war, I would witness something that would haunt me for the rest of my life. It was a crisp autumn morning, and our unit had been tasked with pushing back the German forces in a small town near the coast. We had been making steady progress, but the enemy's resistance was fierce. As we approached a clearing, I saw something that made my blood run cold. A German tank, one of their fearsome tigers, was in the middle of the field. But it wasn't advancing or retreating. It was floating. At first I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me. The lack of sleep and constant stress of battle must have been taking its toll. I rubbed my eyes, blinked hard, but the scene before me remained unchanged. The massive steel beast was suspended about 10 feet off the ground, its tracks spinning uselessly in the air. I wasn't the only one who noticed. My fellow soldiers had stopped in their tracks, their mouths hanging open in disbelief. We all stood there, frozen, as if moving might shatter this impossible moment. That's when I saw it. A massive metallic object hovering silently above the tank. It was like nothing I'd ever seen before. shaped like a disc. It must have been at least 100 feet in diameter. The surface was smooth and reflective, almost like polished silver, but with a faint blue glow emanating from its edges. There were no visible engines, no propellers, nothing that could explain how this enormous craft was defying gravity. As we watched, paralyzed by a mixture of fear and awe, a beam of intense white light shot down from the center of the disc, enveloping the tank completely. The light was so bright it hurt to look at directly, but I couldn't tear my eyes away. In that beam, the tank began to rise higher and higher until it was level with the bottom of the disc. I could hear screaming coming from inside the tank. The German soldiers inside were obviously panicking, and who could blame them? Their voices were muffled but distinct, a mixture of confusion and terror that chilled me to the bone. I saw movement through the tank's viewports, shadowy figures thrashing about, desperately trying to make sense of what was happening to them. One of the hatches started to open, and for a brief moment I saw a soldier's arm reaching out, grasping at the air, as if trying to find something to hold on to. But before he could escape, the hatch slammed shut with a force that seemed to come from the light itself. The screams intensified, becoming more frantic and desperate. And then, in an instant, they were silenced. The tank, still bathed in that unearthly light, was pulled up into an opening that appeared on the underside of the disc. It was like watching a whale swallow a fish. Quick, efficient, and utterly terrifying. The moment the tank disappeared, inside, the opening sealed itself, leaving no trace that it had ever existed. The entire event couldn't have lasted more than a minute, but it felt like an eternity. As the disc began to ascend, taking the tank and its crew with it, I felt a wave of nausea wash over me. My mind was reeling, trying to make sense of what I had just witnessed. The craft moved with an eerie silence, no sound of engines or any kind of propulsion. It simply rose higher and higher, picking up speed as it went. Within seconds, it had become nothing more than a tiny speck in the sky, and then it was gone altogether, leaving behind a stunned group of soldiers and an empty battlefield. For a long moment, no one spoke. The silence was deafening, broken only by the distant sounds of war that now seemed so insignificant compared to what we had just experienced. I looked around at my fellow soldiers, their faces pale and drawn. Some were shaking, others seemed frozen in place, their eyes still fixed on the spot where the disc had been. It was Private Johnson who finally broke the silence. "What the hell was that?" he whispered, his voice trembling. No one answered because no one had an answer. How could we explain what we had just seen? It defied everything we knew about the world, about science, about the very nature of reality. I remember thinking that if I hadn't seen it with my own eyes, I would never have believed it. Even now, as I write this decades later, part of me still can't believe it happened. But it did happen, and the memory of it is as vivid now as it was on that day in 1943. In the immediate aftermath, we were all in a state of shock. Our commanding officer, Captain Roberts, tried to regain control of the situation. He ordered us to sweep the area, looking for any evidence of what had occurred. But there was nothing to find. No debris, no marks on the ground where the tank had been hovering, not even a single track left behind. It was as if the tank and its crew had never existed at all. As we searched, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Every time I looked up at the sky, I half expected to see that metallic disc returning. The fear of being taken, of disappearing without a trace just like those German soldiers, was overwhelming. I found myself jumping at every sound. my heart racing with each unexpected movement in my peripheral vision. But nothing happened. Whatever force had taken the tank seemed content with its prize and didn't return for us. As night fell, we set up camp, but no one slept. We sat in small groups, talking in hushed voices about what we had seen. Some tried to rationalize it, suggesting it might have been some new secret weapon. Others spoke of divine intervention or demonic forces. But deep down, I think we all knew the truth. We had witnessed something not of this world. The implications of that were too enormous, too terrifying to fully comprehend. The next morning, we were ordered to continue our advance as if nothing had happened. The war, after all, didn't stop for unexplained phenomena. But how could we just go on? The world had changed for us, and we were expected to keep fighting, as if it hadn't. I remember looking at my rifle and feeling how inadequate it seemed now. What good would bullets do against beings who could pluck tanks from the earth as easily as picking flowers? As we moved forward, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were now fighting two wars, one against the Axis powers and another against an unknown enemy that lurked in the skies. The incident was quickly hushed up by our superiors. We were ordered not to speak of it to anyone, not even to other soldiers in our unit who hadn't been present. They told us it was for security reasons, to prevent panic and maintain morale, but I suspected there was more to it than that. The fear in our commanding officers' eyes betrayed their own uncertainty and helplessness in the face of what had happened. For weeks after the incident, I struggled to sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that metallic disc, heard the screams of those German soldiers as they were taken. I kept wondering what had happened to them. Were they dead? Were they being subjected to some kind of experimentation? Or were they somewhere so far beyond our comprehension that we couldn't even begin to imagine their fate? The not knowing was almost worse than witnessing the abduction itself. I found myself obsessing over every detail of that day, replaying it in my mind over and over again, looking for some clue, some explanation that I might have missed. But there was nothing. Just the inexplicable reality of what we had seen. I started to notice strange things in the days and weeks that followed. Lights in the sky that moved in ways no aircraft should be able to, odd atmospheric disturbances that our meteorologists couldn't explain. And sometimes, late at night, I swore I could hear a low, pulsing hum that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. My fellow soldiers who had witnessed the event were similarly affected. We formed a sort of unspoken brotherhood, united by our shared experience and the burden of secrecy we were forced to carry. We would exchange glances across the camp, communicating volumes without saying a word. Some of us couldn't handle it. Private Johnson, who had been the first to speak after the incident, was sent back home after suffering a complete mental breakdown. Others became reckless in battle, as if daring whatever force had taken that tank to come for them too. I found myself torn between wanting to forget and needing to remember. Part of me wished I could erase that day from my memory, go back to seeing the world as I had before, but another part knew that what I had witnessed was too important, too world-changing to simply ignore. I began to keep a secret journal, writing down everything I could remember about the incident and my thoughts in the aftermath. I hid it carefully, knowing that if it were discovered, I would likely face severe consequences. But I felt compelled to record it all, to leave some record of what had happened in case it happened again. As the war dragged on, the memory of that day in Italy never faded, but it was pushed to the back of my mind by the constant struggle for survival. The horrors of war, the blood, the death, the destruction became a grim daily reality that almost made the alien abduction seem like a distant dream. Almost, but not quite. There were moments, in the quiet lulls between battles, when I'd find myself staring at the sky, half expecting to see that metallic disc appear again. I'd catch myself wondering about the crew of that German tank, imagining what might have become of them. Were they still alive, suspended in some kind of stasis, or had they met a fate worse than anything we could imagine on Earth? The not knowing gnawed at me, a constant itch in the back of my mind that I couldn't scratch. I began to notice patterns in the night sky that I'd never paid attention to before. The movements of stars and planets took on new significance, and I found myself searching for any sign of abnormality, any hint that we weren't alone. My fellow soldiers who had witnessed the event were similarly affected. We'd gather in small groups, speaking in hushed tones about our theories and fears. Some believed it was a one-time occurrence, a freak incident never to be repeated. Others were convinced it was just the beginning of something much larger. I couldn't decide which possibility terrified me more. As the war neared its end, I thought, I might finally be able to put the incident behind me. I dreamed of returning home, of picking up the pieces of my life and trying to find some semblance of normalcy. But fate, it seemed, had other plans. It was during the final push into Germany in the spring of 1945 when it happened again. We were advancing through a heavily forested area when the sky suddenly darkened, as if a massive cloud had passed in front of the sun. The air grew thick and heavy, charged with an energy that made the hair on the back of my neck stand on end. I knew even before I looked up what I would see. There it was, the same metallic disc, or one identical to it, hovering silently above the treetops. My heart began to race, a mixture of fear and a perverse excitement coursing through my veins. This time I wasn't the only one who had seen it before. Several of my fellow soldiers who had been present in Italy were with me, and I saw the recognition and terror in their eyes. We all froze, waiting to see what would happen next. Would it take another tank? A whole platoon? Or had it come back? For us, the witnesses who had escaped the first time. The disc remained motionless for what felt like an eternity, but was probably only a few minutes. Then, without warning, it emitted a pulse of energy that swept over us like a wave. I felt it pass through my body, a tingling sensation that left me feeling disoriented and nauseous. Around me, soldiers were dropping to their knees, some clutching, their heads in pain, others vomiting uncontrollably. I managed to stay on my feet, though my vision was blurry and my ears were ringing. Through the haze I saw something that chilled me to my core. A beam of light, similar to the one that had taken the tank in Italy, shot down from the disc, but this time it didn't seem to be targeting any specific object. Instead, it began to sweep across the forest, moving in a precise grid pattern. Wherever the light touched, the trees and undergrowth simply vanished. Not burned, not uprooted, but completely erased from existence. It was as if that section of the forest had never been there at all. I watched in horror as the beam methodically cleared a large circular area, leaving behind nothing but bare earth. And then, as suddenly as it had appeared, the disc shot upwards and vanished into the sky, leaving us stunned and terrified in the eerie silence of the newly created clearing. In the aftermath of this second encounter, the military's response was swift and severe. We were isolated, debriefed for hours on end, and subjected to a battery of medical tests. The official story was that we had been exposed to an experimental German chemical weapon causing mass hallucinations. But we knew the truth, and no amount of official denial could erase what we had seen and experienced. The clearing in the forest was explained away as the result of a new type of Allied bombing raid, despite the lack of any evidence of explosions or fire. I watched as some of my comrades broke under the pressure, either accepting the official lie or suffering complete mental breakdowns. Those of us who insisted on the truth of what we had witnessed were threatened with court-martials or commitments to psychiatric facilities. I learned quickly to keep my mouth shut, but my mind never stopped working, never stopped trying to make sense of what had happened. As the war came to an end and we prepared to return home, I felt a mix of relief and dread. Relief to be leaving, the horrors of war behind, but dread at the thought of carrying this secret with me, of trying to reintegrate into a society that had no idea of the otherworldly threat that loomed above us. Back in civilian life, I struggled to adjust. The mundane concerns of everyday existence seemed trivial compared to what I had witnessed. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were all living in a kind of willful ignorance, going about our lives oblivious to the fact that at any moment, everything could change. I tried to research similar incidents, spending hours in libraries poring over newspapers and scientific journals. I found hints here and there, unexplained disappearances, strange lights in the sky, accounts of lost time. But nothing concrete, nothing that could corroborate what I had seen. It was maddening, knowing the truth but being unable to prove it or share it with anyone. I became paranoid, constantly looking over my shoulder, convinced that I was being watched. Maybe by the government, maybe by the beings who controlled those metallic discs, or maybe by both. I installed extra locks on my doors, covered my windows with heavy curtains, and slept with a loaded gun under my pillow. My family and friends noticed the change in me, of course. They attributed it to post-traumatic stress from the war, and in a way they weren't wrong. But how could I explain that my trauma wasn't just from the battles I had fought, but from the realization that everything we thought we knew about our world and our place in it was wrong? Years passed, and the memories of those encounters never faded. If anything, they became more vivid, more insistent in my mind. I started to notice patterns in global events that others seemed to miss. Unexplained phenomena that were quickly dismissed or covered up, technological advancements that seemed to leap forward in ways that didn't make sense. I couldn't help but wonder if these were all connected to what I had seen during the war. Were we being visited more frequently than anyone realized? Was our own progress being guided or influenced by these otherworldly beings? The questions were endless, and the lack of answers was maddening. I tried to live a normal life, to focus on my job, my family. But it was always there in the background, this knowledge that the world was not what it seemed. I would find myself staring at the sky for hours, especially at night, searching for any sign of those metallic discs. Sometimes I thought I saw something, a flash of light, an object moving in ways that defied conventional physics, but it was always gone before I could be sure. Was I really seeing something, or was my mind playing tricks on me, desperate for some confirmation that I wasn't crazy, that what I had experienced was real? Now, as I sit here writing this account, I'm an old man. Most of my fellow soldiers who witnessed those events have passed on, taking their secrets to the grave. Those who are left are dismissed as senile or attention-seeking when they try to speak out. But I know what I saw, what we all saw. It was real, it happened, and I believe it's still happening. I've spent a lifetime trying to understand, to find some greater meaning in those encounters. Were they simply observing us, studying our conflicts, or was there some deeper purpose to their actions? I don't have the answers, and I likely never will, but I feel compelled to share my story, to put it out there in the hope that someone, somewhere, might be able to connect the dots in a way I never could. Maybe you've seen something similar. Maybe you've experienced your own unexplainable encounter. If so, know that you're not alone. There's more to our world, to our universe, than we can possibly imagine. I've seen it with my own eyes, and that knowledge has been both a burden and a gift. As I near the end of my life, I find myself looking to the sky more often, wondering if I'll see those metallic discs one last time. Part of me hopes I will, while another part dreads it. But whatever happens, I know this: we are not alone, and the sooner we accept that truth, the better prepared we'll be for whatever comes next. So, what did you think of this story? Did it scare you? Was there a part that gave you chills or stuck with you the most? I'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below. If you've had a similar experience or have suggestions for improving future videos, let me know too. Thank you for watching and being part of this amazing community. See you in the next story.